Hi, I'm Patricia. He hit me so hard that there was a dark, painfully blurred mark under my eye, warm and pulsating, like a reminder, and my parents saw it. They stood in the doorway, as if on a stage they didn't want to go on, and they looked straight at me, at my face, already distorted by pain, already painted in blue and yellow tones, and then, almost in sync, as if by unspoken agreement, they turned away, and this gesture was worse than a scream. It was final, like a sentence that could not be appealed. And he, the one who stood at the center of my pain, laughed, lounging in his chair as if in a throne, with that lazy grin that seemed to say that the whole world was arranged for him, that everything that happened was according to his will, and he said, "You have a polite family," and these words, spoken with disdain, echoed in the emptiness of my chest. That night I sat alone, silent, small, covered in bruises, not only on my skin, but inside, where the pain lingers especially long, where neither ice nor medicine helps, and I lit a candle, not for the sake of light, but for something more, as if this fire could mark the boundary between me and the darkness in which I was drowning, and 30 minutes later, when the lock clicked again, I no longer remained below. I rose. I took a step, not with my body, but with my soul. Before we go on, tell me honestly, have you ever kept silent to keep the peace, this fragile, crystal world where every sound could be your last, and then realize that it cost you everything? Your dignity, your confidence, yourself? Leave a comment. What time is it where you are? Would you also get up if you knew that this could be the last time you respect yourself? At that moment, when I heard the knock, my body tensed not from fear, but from habit, like a dog accustomed to being shouted at, like a bird living near an airport, and I was still sitting on the couch, pressing a damp towel to my left eye, trying not to breathe too deeply, because my skin was sensitive, inflamed, as if burned from the inside, and I did not cry, not once, because tears make the pain inside worse, turn a squeezed chest into an empty echo chamber. Silence. At least the silence was reliably enveloping, like a blanket, like a cocoon, like oblivion. The door opened before I could get up, and my parents, as always, walked in themselves, without knocking, without asking, as if this house still belonged to them, or as if I myself were their property. No warning, just the rustling of grocery bags and the familiar smell of fabric softener, cheap, sharp, and the soap they had been using for decades, as if nothing was more important than this aroma of stability. I turned slightly to face them, not out of desire to show off, but because it was the only movement I had the strength to make. It was enough. My mother stopped mid-step, her hands clutching the plastic bag began to tremble, her fingers white with tension, but she said nothing, not a single word. My father's eyes narrowed, not in horror or concern, but as if he were calculating something, measuring something, the bruise, or the level of threat, or the price he would have to pay for participating. No one said a word. Behind me, the television continued to hum, either in the background or mockingly, producing another sitcom rerun with a canned laugh that was alien, out of place, offensively cheerful. It contrasted sharply with the thick, viscous silence that hung in the room, like the smoke from a long-extinguished fire, smelling of the burning of shame. And then, as if on schedule, Amerigo appeared from the hallway, shirtless, holding a half-empty beer, leaning casually against the door frame, with the same self-assured grin, and said, "Well, look at this." The polite family is back, and there was no shame in his voice, only laziness and arrogance. He didn't even pretend. He didn't try to hide his superiority, didn't soften either his intonation or his posture. My father nodded, dryly, almost formally. My mother looked away and walked past, as if she didn't notice either of us, as if we were both part of the interior she had long since gotten used to. They both headed into the kitchen, carefully placing the bags on the counter, with the same meticulous pedantry as if they were filming a commercial for quiet family comfort. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. And then they were gone without a word. The door clicked quietly behind them, quieter than my own thoughts, more like an exhalation than a farewell. After that, time seemed to emerge from under the water. I heard the clock ticking, loudly, boldly, as if mocking the silence. Or maybe I just imagined it. Amerigo burped behind me, unashamedly, and plopped down in a chair with the air of a man who no longer had anything to prove, because he had already proven the most important thing. He was the boss. The chair creaked under his weight. I didn't turn to look at him. I knew what I would see, his stomach rising and falling with each slow breath, his tired eyelids half closed, and the crooked, poisonous grin frozen at the corners of his lips. My fingers touched the bruise again, this time not for comfort, but to remember. Because the truth is, it didn't start today. It never does. I finally said it out loud. "Stop treating me like I'm something you bought at a discount store," I said sharply, without raising my voice, but there was such determination in the words, such transparent, undisguised weariness, that the air in the room grew thicker for a moment. Amerigo was already halfway through his beer in the kitchen, and he didn't even flinch, just looking at me as if I'd interrupted him from finishing an episode of a show in which he believed he was the star. "Are you done?" he asked, his voice indifferent, almost bored, and in that moment it seemed as if his indifference was enveloping me in a sticky film from which there was no escape. "I'm serious," I said, and that was enough, because the slap came so fast that my body didn't even have time to tense up, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. There was a ringing in my ear, as if a thin string had snapped inside. I staggered, tripped, fell onto the edge of the table, and he met my fall with the same calm with which one watches a cup fall from the table, with detached curiosity. The air left my lungs with a dry groan. I blinked, and he, as if nothing had happened, apologized, automatically, extended his hand. His voice became soft, almost gentle. "Baby, come on. You always push. You always have to make a tragedy out of it," and I don't remember nodding, but I know for sure, I did not argue. In this silence of refusal there was no sound, no form, only emptiness. When he came back into the living room, hissing in pain, as if this had happened to him and not to me, he sank back into his chair, already drifting off to sleep, as if he had done a duty that could be postponed until the next outburst, and the bottle of beer leaned against his chest, as if it had been held not by fingers but by years of repeated gesture. The room smelled of cheap hops and something else, a mixture of his cologne, which he still considered manly, and something heavy and unwashable, as if the scent had become part of the furniture. I stood up slowly, went to the bathroom, wiped the blood from my lip with toilet paper, not flinching even when the paper turned red again, and looked into the mirror for a long time, reservedly, as if it were not me behind the glass but someone whose story was familiar but alien to me. The woman in the reflection looked tired, not from one night, but from a lifetime, but she was not broken. Not this time. I don't matter to them. I don't matter to him. But I exist, I said out loud, and my voice was firm, almost alien, as if someone else had stepped into my shoes and finally spoken. I reached for my phone, opened the message thread marked only with an initial, typed, "I'm ready," and then deleted it, changed my mind, typed again, and this time sent it. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need one. As I walked back into the living room, I noticed the sky outside the window had darkened, as if someone had poured ink onto watery glass. A cold breeze slid under the window pane, rustling the curtains like the breath of something large and cautious. 30 minutes passed, those 30 minutes when the air becomes thick and your mind becomes clear, and you know there's no turning back. And then, finally, the lock on the front door clicked. Amerigo stirred, chuckled, without getting up, because he knew everything was under control. I got up, went to the door and opened it. Vanessa was standing there, without a coat, only in a thick gray sweater and jeans, simple, focused, with a black travel bag in one hand and a brown folder under her arm. Her hair was combed back, her face was clear, like those of someone who had already decided everything, but her eyes were riveted to mine, and in those eyes there was so much expectation, so much silence, accumulated over the years, that I felt like she was talking to me without opening her mouth. She didn't say hello, didn't smile, just stepped inside, looking first at me, then at my bruise, then at Amerigo, who hadn't moved. I nodded almost imperceptibly, and she set her bag on the floor and put the folder next to her. Not a word. I walked into the kitchen. The floor creaked under my bare feet, as if confirming each step. I took a small black envelope out of the drawer, the kind you keep letters in that don't need stamps, only determination. Amerigo stirred again, muttered something unintelligible, opened one eye, and without looking away, I put the envelope next to his beer. He squinted, trying to concentrate. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, still half awake. I looked at him. "Really? Not through fear, not through resignation, but straight. For the first time all day. I didn't lower my eyes. I didn't back down. "Don't worry," I said quietly, my voice so clear that even the television would have stopped playing if he had been alive. "It's not poison," I froze, "but it could kill someone else." He blinked, confused, and reached lazily for the envelope, missing. I turned and walked down the hallway. The carpet muffled my footsteps, as if protecting me from the memories. Vanessa followed silently behind me, her bag already slung over her shoulder, each step more confident than mine. The bedroom door slammed behind me, and I let the silence do the rest. I didn't slam it. I didn't let it slam. I closed it carefully, slowly, with some strange trepidation, like I was putting a child to bed. Vanessa was already unzipping her bag when I finally turned around. The room smelled of lemon cleaner and a faint, elusive fear, not mine, but his, still clinging to the wallpaper, the carpet, the pillows. He hadn't been here in weeks, but his presence was still oppressive. Vanessa had put the folder on the bed, right next to a neatly folded change of clothes, a new toothbrush in its package, and a black leather notebook with bookmarks peeking out, and there was more care in that silent action than any touch she had made in years. I glanced at myself in the mirror above the dresser, where the reflection seemed oddly truer than I did these days, and the swelling that had slid from my eye was slowly spreading into a dull bruise, without clear edges, like a spreading stain of shame that had absorbed everything: pain, silence, memory. I pressed 2 fingers to it, not to ease the pain or to dull the throbbing, but to remind myself that this was fucking real, that this wasn't an illusion, not a dream, not a scary story told by someone else's voice, but my life, which he had ruined, and which my parents had seen, turned away and left. Vanessa had taken out a tape recorder at that moment, tiny, the size of a lipstick, silver, almost a toy, and in a quiet, almost apologetic voice she said, "The batteries are fresh," and then, without looking me in the eye, she handed me a folder, as if she were handing over a weapon that could not only protect but also destroy. I sat down on the edge of the bed, and the mattress sank slightly under me, as if acknowledging that the time had come, and I opened the folder, the very one whose every page I, despite everything, knew. Every line resonated within me, like an old scar that had begun to hurt again. They weren't just documents, they were a record of my silence, a notarized power of attorney granting me complete control over an account we supposedly shared but which he used like a personal cash register, screenshots of online transfers, numbers, dates, names, all leading to the same truth: my money disappearing into the depths of some poker app with cartoon dice and flaming slots that he favored while I counted pennies for milk. Incident reports that I'd started writing in different months, January, June, last week, each one never sent, but each one marked with the same red pen Vanessa always kept in her purse, like a reminder that the truth needed to be written down and underlined, even if it wasn't yet spoken. And at the very end, the lease, a tiny apartment 12 miles south, in her name but signed by me. "I paid for the first 2 months," Vanessa said calmly. "You don't owe me anything. I need you to know that." I didn't answer. I didn't cry. I just turned to the last page, closed the folder, and laid it on the bed, as if I was giving it back some of my pain. 2 weeks ago, we were sitting in the public library, pretending to read cookbooks, leafing through recipes that had no salt or flavor because the real point was between the lines, and she leaned toward me and whispered, "You don't have to have all this to believe in yourself, but the court does. His lawyer, he'll dig." I asked her why she was doing all this, why she was risking her safety, her job, her peace, and she looked at me the way people look at people who have lived in the dark for too long to understand that the light is not a threat. "Because I believe you. And because I won't leave you here to rot while they call it marriage." I didn't sleep that night. I just stared at the ceiling and allowed myself, for the first time in years, to believe that I mattered. To someone. Really. Vanessa tapped the phone with her finger. "We share a window. After him, he'll be watching every door, every message, every rustle." I nodded. He'd already lost control. He just hadn't realized it yet. Her hand disappeared into the side pocket of her bag and pulled out an old flip phone. No internet, no GPS, no cameras, just buttons and calls. She handed it to me. "He'll find out," she whispered, almost alarmed. He'll turn the house upside down. My fingers closed around the phone. It was cold, heavy, like a decision. Then we'd better move before the couch stops snoring, I said, half jokingly, but as if on cue, a familiar, unpleasant creaking of wood suddenly rang out in the silence, a sound that instantly made the skin on my shoulder stretch. The rustle of feet. The light clink of glass on glass. The chair groaned, as if tired of its owner, and then, silence. Then footsteps. He moved again. I opened the bedroom door just enough to hear. The front room was still quiet, but the air was different, tense as before a storm, and I sensed something dangerous lurking in the new silence. He'd probably already opened the envelope I'd left next to his beer. I could imagine his face changing as he read the statement, the red circles, the numbers Vanessa had underlined, the withdrawals, the dates, the little yellow note at the bottom. You're going to need a lawyer, not a beer. Vanessa nodded toward the hallway. Time, she whispered, but before I could say anything, we heard it, heavy footsteps heading straight for the bedroom, a weight that made the floor begin to creak. But I didn't wait. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway just as he raised his fist to knock. He froze, caught in mid-motion, like an animal in the headlights. His eyes widened, his pupils became narrow dots, his lips parted as if he wanted to shout, to break into the usual "what are you allowing yourself to do?" but the voice did not come. I silently picked up the phone, squeezing it in my hand like an amulet, like a symbol. This envelope is not the end. It is only the beginning. He blinked, at first confused, as if his brain was trying to digest an unexpected shift in the usual balance of power, then his gaze darkened, his face distorted in a grimace of anger mixed with resentment, and his hand abruptly darted forward, grabbed my wrist, not hard, not enough to leave a mark, but confidently enough to remind me I was still in his field of control, still within reach, and in this grip one could read not only the desire to stop me, but also a desperate attempt to hold on to the remnants of power slipping through his fingers. And this time, for the first time, I didn't see the usual shadow of aggression or pleasure from superiority in his eyes. This time it was panic mixed with a feeling of guilt creeping through him that he wouldn't admit even under torture. Before I could squeeze out a word, Vanessa, like a shadow, came out from behind me, and in her hands was already holding a phone, the screen of which glowed like a bright rectangle of recording. "Let her go," she said in a voice honed like a blade, without shouting, but with such inner strength that even the air froze for a moment. "It's already live." Almerigo, as if he had really been burned, let go of my wrist, took a step back, as if he wanted to distance himself from what had happened, and his eyes darted between us, searching for support that was no longer there, and he realized it too late. I took a step forward, my back straight, my shoulders squared, my face even, calm, almost official. "Smile, Amerigo," I said, and there was no mockery or malice in my voice, only a clear final chord. "Finally, you're in the frame." He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink, and that silence, taut as a string, was louder than any scream, louder than even the slap he gave so easily. His face twitched, spasmodically, like a man who had just been shot with the truth, and not a single muscle could control the reaction, just a flicker, as if a wire had shorted inside him. And then there was a sound, not a blow, not anger, but something desperate, broken. "You set me up," he breathed, his voice breaking, like someone who had just realized that the smoke was not just a signal, but a fire already under his feet. "You dragged your friend into our marriage? You are trying to ruin me." His chest was moving too fast, his voice breaking treacherously between accusation and disbelief, and I stood there, not moving, not shaking, just watching. Vanessa, still holding the phone, tilted it slightly, continuing to film, and her other hand wrapped around the strap of her bag, as if anchoring herself in space. She did not speak, did not interfere, did not console. She was simply there, as a witness, as protection, as a point of no return. Amerigo began to thrash about like an animal whose cage walls had suddenly disappeared. "It's a trap. You can't just set someone up like that, record them without permission." Now there was that familiar brittleness in his voice, a high, almost shrill edge that always broke through when he knew he was losing, but still hoped to wriggle out. He pointed his finger towards the kitchen. "You brought a witness here, into our home, into our marriage, to lure me. I raised my head and, without raising my voice, calmly said, I didn't bring a witness. I brought protection. His jaw twitched like a man about to lose his temper, and he hissed, I swear to God, I'm going to call the police myself. I'm going to tell them you're crazy, you're unstable, you're cruel, you hacked my email, you've been stalking me. I tilted my head to the side, as if asking for details. Okay, I said. He froze. What? He asked. I walked slowly to the coffee table, calm, unhurried, as if this whole thing had just been an extended rehearsal scene, picked up the manila envelope I'd left there earlier, and handed it to him the way a waitress hands over a check, no emotion, no words. I already called them. You better be ready when they knock. This is what they're going to see when they walk in. His fingers clutched the envelope, and with trembling hands he pulled out the stapled package from inside, and began to leaf through the pages, dates, medical records, photographs, a copy of the emergency restraining order petition Vanessa had filed at dawn. At the top was a note, domestic security threat. The silence that followed was not relief. It was weight. The weight of truth, falling on a man accustomed to impunity, to having his actions followed by nothing but another chapter in someone else's suffering. He turned the page slowly. One hand fell limply at his side, the other clutched the paper, and this time he was truly speechless, without an attempt to speak, to explain, to argue. I took a step back, not from fear, but simply because the scene needed air. And it was at that moment that my mind, as it always does at such moments, went back to the beginning, 2 months ago, when it all began. I didn't plan it. I didn't plot it. I just woke up one morning with a bruise behind my ear and couldn't remember where it came from. And then, for the first time, I took a picture. Just like that. Just in case. I uploaded it to a folder I created under a fake name, Rivertown Books, and it became the first page of my truth. Then there was the night I locked myself in the bathroom, not because I was hoping to hide, but because the walls were closer, the sound reverberated off the tiles and created the illusion of boundaries, and I sat shivering on the cold tiles, listening to Amerigo knock on the door, insistently, dully, louder and louder with each knock, more and more angry, as if each of his Patricia were an alarm bell, and at that moment, when his voice became like a bark, I pressed record, without thinking. Simply by instinct, like a person who can no longer trust her memory, and every word, from threats to humiliations, from mockery to whining, hit the microphone, hit the phone, and then, almost without realizing why, I forwarded it to Vanessa. She answered only 2 hours later, dryly, simply, keep documenting. I believe you, and those 4 words hit harder than any slap he'd ever given me, because they were an acknowledgement of my reality. Later, I asked a nurse friend to help document a visit to the emergency room when I said I'd slipped in the garage, and she didn't ask any questions, just hugged me for a few seconds longer than usual, which was enough to keep me from feeling like a liar. And then there were the voicemails, not the loud ones, but the quiet ones of rain on a windowsill, like the one he'd left last week, drunk and slow and completely sincere in its cruelty. Nobody believes you anyway, miss. I have a job. I'm the one who takes care of everything. You're just here. You're nothing. And that voice, that smooth, cool, almost businesslike voice, became my safety net, my fortress to fall back on if I started to doubt myself again. When I returned to the living room, he tried again, this time in a different way, through what had always worked before. You know what people will think? That you're obsessed. That you're unstable. I'll tell everyone you were following me. You're paranoid. And I didn't answer. I didn't try to argue. I just opened the app on my phone, turned the volume up to max, hit play, and his voice filled the room like poison seeping under the door, like smoke from smoldering truth, and the words he'd spoken for no one else's ears were now loud and clear and undeniable. You're so stupid it hurts. You think you're someone? You're my property. You're a liability. A burden. I'm stuck with you. Vanessa stood in the kitchen doorway, unblinking, her eyes blank, icy and blank, like a jury that has already passed judgment. Amerigo flinched. His face went pale. He looked smaller, less like a man than a boy caught stealing, still hoping someone else will take the blame. There was silence in the room, just the hum of the refrigerator and the echo of his words bouncing off the walls. And then a red-blue flicker through the blinds, thin as the breath of a new reality, at first barely noticeable, then distinct. Amerigo turned to the window. You didn't. You really called them? I didn't look. I didn't need to. I walked slowly to the door, found the cold metal handle with my hand, stopped, inhaled. Let's see if you're smirking on camera now, I said, almost kindly. The knock was soft, professionally polite, but Amerigo's voice behind it shattered like glass, sharp shards of panic. She's setting me up. Don't believe a word of it. Her friend is hiding in the kitchen with a camera. But by the time the two officers came into view, the beams of their flashlights had slid along the walls of the hallway, and Amerigo was already backing toward the stairs, his hands raised, theatrically, in a rehearsed gesture that was trembling. She waylaid me, he said quickly, trying to sound indignant. She's unstable, she's been acting strangely for weeks. She's trying to ruin my life. I didn't say a word. I simply stepped aside and pointed to the kitchen table, where the folders lay neatly stacked, each one labeled, numbered, dated. The USB drive Vanessa handed me landed in the palm of one of the officers with a soft click. I suggest you start with the timeline, I said calmly. One of the officers, a young man with a sharp fringe and a sharp chin, opened the top folder, and his partner, a woman in her 50s, experienced, with a tired but attentive gaze, looked from Vanessa to me and asked, with a hint of surprise, "Did you do all this yourself?" I nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The young man whistled softly, scrolling through the images on the flash drive. "Are these time-stamped?" he asked. "Yes." "And confirmed," I said, my voice even, without a catch. Amerigo, still standing by the stairs, laughed, a laughter as fragile as glass, hollow, without support. "Wow. This is insane. She staged this. This is all an act." The officers didn't react. The young man continued to scroll, and the woman picked up her radio. They asked him to sit down. He didn't. Then the junior officer, without changing his expression, unfastened the radio and muttered a short code that I did not hear, but which, like a key, turned off the last of Amerigo's resistance. His shoulders sagged, and he belatedly sank slowly into a chair. By the time the sun sank behind the forest that grew like a wall of shadow behind our house, dividing the evening from the remains of the day, we were already sitting in two different patrol cars, leaving the familiar streets where every tree knew too much, where every neighbor had been silent for too long, and heading to the station, each in her own way, and me, hugging my knees, silent, with my back straight, in the back seat of a car, behind the glass of which the world looked as if it had been painted by a new hand, and he, Amerigo, in another, with the same straight spine, but with a face frozen in the mask of a victim. I rode with Officer Brenly, a woman in her 50s with a piercing gaze and the name tag Brenly sewn onto her uniform, and the cold leather of the leather seat, despite the summer evening, burning through her jeans, like a warning that everything that had been before was no longer protective. At the station, Vanessa and I were separated immediately, not roughly but firmly, and before she was led down another corridor, she looked at me, calmly, firmly, not smiling but also not hesitating, like someone who knows that the worst has happened before and now it will just be difficult. I was led into an interview room, pale green, windowless, undecorated, just a metal table, two plastic chairs, and a camera in the corner, buzzing faintly like a fly stuck in a web. Officer Brenly returned alone, carefully closing the door behind her, as if to indicate that the conversation would be informal but important. "You know," she said, taking out her notebook, "it's rare to see someone so prepared." I didn't smile. I had no reason to. I wasn't preparing to fight, I was preparing to be believed. She nodded slowly, looking into my eyes, studying not the words but the person who spoke them, as if deciding which side of my story to approach. We went through all the folders. She asked questions, precise, measured, not too soft, not too sharp, and I answered them without tears. I had cried in every room of this house, on every floor, in every crack between closets and doors, and now I had neither the time nor the energy nor even the desire for it. Amerigo's voice came from the hallway, loud, brash, aggressive, so familiar that my heart sank for a moment, not from fear but from memory, as if my body recognized it before my mind. Brenly excused herself and left, and a few minutes later I saw a man in a gray suit enter the room across the hall, carrying a briefcase, with his hair slicked back, and walking like someone who wasn't surprised by an emergency call. He had arrived too quickly, which meant he had been kept on standby, that he had probably been sent by Father Amerigo, a man of influence, a former Forsyth County judge. The energy in the building changed instantly, like a change in the pressure in a room. When Brenly returned, her gaze was a little more reserved, her questions a little more insistent, and they no longer sounded like, "What happened?" but, "Why didn't you say anything?" "So," she said, tapping her fingernail on the copy of the complaint, "you haven't contacted the police until today. Why now?" I didn't look away, didn't sigh, just pulled the last document out of the folder, the one I'd been guarding like a last card. "I didn't wait," I said. "I documented everything and warned someone months ago." I put the complaint on the table. It had been signed by my therapist 6 months ago. It was plain language, no euphemisms, an escalation risk assessment, a clear name, Amerigo, and a final paragraph, written in clear, confident handwriting. The client has reasonable concerns for her safety in the marital home. She is advised to take immediate legal action if incidents escalate. Brenly read it twice, her lips pressed into a thin line, but still she asked the question I had dreaded most, not because she didn't know it would come, but because it always did. "Are you sure you're not just trying to get ahead in a divorce? In property division? In child custody?" My hands shook for a second, but I folded them tightly in my lap, almost interlocking my fingers, keeping myself in the present. I knew what I looked like. Dry-eyed, poised, too calm to be broken, too composed to be unsuspecting. If I'd waited until he hit harder, I'd have been accused of holding my tongue too long. Coming now means I'm calculating. So I prepared. Because I knew no one would give me the benefit of the doubt. She didn't answer, just made a note on her pad, and in that moment my mind briefly went back to my therapist's office, a warm, soft, safe place, 3 months ago, when I'd asked, almost in a whisper, "If I leave and no one helps, and he kills me anyway, will they say I'm crazy for staying?" And she'd looked at me without blinking and said, "Don't leave so they can forget." That night I started planning, not for revenge, not for punishment, but for survival. Back in reality, I saw Brenly get up, say she'd be back in a few minutes. I stayed in the room alone, counting the slow ticks of the clock on the wall. When she came back, she exhaled loudly, as if with effort, and said, "We'll keep him for 24 hours. After that, things will get difficult." I nodded, briefly and silently, as if the nod were not an expression of agreement but an internal knot, tightened at a new stage, a point of no return, and Officer Brenly handed me a clipboard with electronic documents, among them my restraining order, the very document that had started it all and which, ironically, meant not the end of the war but its naked form. I signed it without hesitation, without a sigh, without relief, just to fix my signature, as if I were putting a period to a long-written letter that no one wanted to read. There was no applause, not even a sense of victory, only a sequence of steps, one after another, like the automatic mode that allows you to survive when the senses refuse to cooperate. Outside the windows, the sky was becoming faded, gray-blue, like an old canvas forgotten in the attic. It was no longer morning and had not yet become afternoon, and the cold that penetrated the glass did not sting, did not excite, but simply touched, reminding me of the physical body that I had ignored for so long. Vanessa was waiting for me at the foot of the concrete steps of the police station, standing with her arms around herself, and when I approached, her eyes immediately looked up, searching for mine, not demanding words, but as if asking, "Are you still here? Are you all right?" I nodded and, without stopping, turned toward the parking lot, toward my old car, in which the smell of a past life was stored, a smell that could not be removed even by the strongest air fresheners. What I whispered under my breath as I got behind the wheel, "You did it," was the easy part, because it would have been much harder to talk to my mother, to tell her everything and not hear a single word in response, not a whisper, not regret, not a damned, "I'm sorry." The drive back to the rented apartment, a short stretch that had everything, tiredness, anxiety, silence, passed under a thick dome of silence, thick as a wet wool blanket that covered the entire car. It wasn't the silence of fear, no, it was scorched, bloodless, like after a fire, when the ashes have already settled on everything around. Vanessa parked at the curb outside my temporary apartment, a place I couldn't bring myself to call home, because there was no trace of love, no photographs, no smell of coffee in the morning, just beige walls, identical as a hotel, and a kitchen that seemed to whisper, "Don't cook here, just leave." I inserted the key, turned it, and the door clicked so quietly that the sound was the first breath I'd allowed myself all day, a breath not burdened by someone's gaze, not muffled by the sound of a slap. We walked inside. Vanessa got up to get the last bag, set it carefully against the wall where there was nothing, and for a while we both just stood there, not knowing what to do with ourselves, as if the walls refused to accept us. She had stayed with me since dawn, through the report, through the paperwork, through everything the system called procedure but was really agony, numb and ragged. And now we were two women, in a room full of alien furniture and the smell of someone else's life. She unrolled a spare blanket on the threadbare couch and asked, "Do you want me to stay?" I shook my head. "I need to do this myself." She nodded, not arguing. Maybe she understood. Or maybe she just knew this moment wasn't about protection, not about comfort, but about reclaiming my voice. When she left, I was left standing in the middle of the room, unsure what to do with my hands. They felt alien, like they were still holding something, maybe fear, maybe the remnants of the past, maybe guilt. I walked over to the small kitchen table, the plastic veneer peeling around the edges, and sat down. I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over the name I hadn't changed since I was 15. Just Mom. Not Mother. Not Jenny. Not House. Just Mom. I pressed it. The call. And to my surprise, my heart didn't pound in panic, like it had when I was a kid and knew I'd screwed up, or flare up like it used to when Amerigo screamed. It just hurt. Quietly but deeply, like the longing that had been inside me since I'd learned that not all mothers were shields. She answered. "Miss?" Her voice was careful, without warmth or worry, like someone who wasn't interested but was supposed to listen. "I just wanted you to know," I said. "He was arrested." A pause. For what? I swallowed. For what he did to me. She didn't say a word. So I went on. Not because I expected sympathy, but because I needed to hear myself say it out loud, to someone who knew me before I was afraid. I told her. The bruises. The hospitals. The money he took. The screams. I said maybe she'd noticed. Maybe she could come back. A long silence. And then a voice, as even as ever, "Marriage isn't perfect, Mississippi. But if you have to put it this way, at least we raised you strong." My fingers tightened on the edge of the table. That was it. That was her answer. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt the pain in my chest tighten in a slow circle, because in that moment I realized, all this time, I had been hoping. I put the phone down, leaving the ringer on. It lay on the table. Her voice lingered in the background, then died. Gone. I opened my journal, the same one with the thick fabric cover and the burgundy bookmark that Vanessa had once placed in my hands on one of those days when her eyes, trained to see even in silence, began to notice that my gaze had become like silence, not calm, but devastating, like an empty house in which screams lived. I wrote slowly, as if the words were not coming from my head, but making their way from my chest, from the very heart, along the cracked channels of feeling. Today I buried the last illusion, I began. I no longer need her to understand. I just need to stop needing her. When I closed the journal, my hands lingered for a moment on the cover, as if hoping that the warmth of my fingers would be absorbed into the pages and preserve this truth. Across the room, peeking out of the pocket of my old purse, was the same envelope, thick and tight and curved, the one I'd brought to the station, stuffed with copies of audio recordings, photographs, notarized statements, all assembled with the cold persistence of someone who has no one else to trust with her reality. I pulled a clean, clear folder out of the drawer, put the envelope in it, and without hesitation, marked it with a black marker, closed. The sun had already set, and the long shadows from the windowsill slowly crawled across the carpet, making the room unreal, as if filmed, and in this dim light everything seemed quieter than it really was. I made tea, choosing the very flavor, with cinnamon and ginger, not because I was thirsty, but because I needed something in my hands, not a phone, not paper, but a cup, simple, warm, real. I leaned back against the back of the sofa, letting the steam rise into the air, waver subtly and disappear, like everything that was gone, leaving not even a scream. My body still retained the memory of bruises, as if the inner layers of skin were tightened with threads of old blows, but I no longer flinched at the memory. And then there was a knock, not a loud one, just 2 short knocks, but there was a new meaning in that simplicity, as if it were not a threat knocking on the door of the world, but a message. I stood up, opened the door, and there stood Vanessa, her face pale, her lips pressed tightly together, her eyes wide open, not in fear but in disbelief, as if what she had just seen did not fit into her knowledge of reality. "You need to see this," she said, already passing me, grabbed the remote from the coffee table, turned on the small television built into the corner of the kitchen, and we found ourselves inside a live broadcast of the local news. There he was, Amerigo. On the screen. Standing at the lectern. In a button-down shirt, perfectly ironed, with a face as if he had not spent the night in a cell, but was preparing for an interview for an evening talk show. His lawyer stood to the side, nodding as he said, "I never meant to hurt anyone. My wife is going through emotional hardship. It's been a tough time. I just want her to get the help she needs." "Help," Vanessa whispered, looking at me. I didn't blink. I just watched. Watched the screen, watched him smile at the camera, as if this was all a play in which he was the star. And something inside me stopped shaking, as if this final act of theater had finally stripped him bare to the skin. I walked back to the desk, opened the laptop, turned it on. Vanessa, standing behind me, tilted her head. "Who are you?" she asked. I didn't answer. I opened the blank document, a blank sheet of paper, and began typing a letter. Not to the police. Not to the judge. Someone with power, real, genuine power, not the kind at the mayor's office or the precinct, but the kind that could change the way society thought. I wrote to a journalist I knew only through a screen, but whose work changed the law. Alice Carrington. I first saw her one night when I couldn't sleep and turned on the TV to find her telling the story of a woman who had exposed her senator husband. That night, I bookmarked her name. Now, I typed underneath it, "Dear Alice, I don't know if you'll believe me, but I'll give you every reason to believe me." I attached everything, screenshots of the transfers Amerigo had made from my account, audio files in which his voice was full of venom, photos of bruises I'd taken as soon as they appeared, medical reports, pharmacy receipts, hospital invoices, text messages in which the thread hid between polite words, like snakes under rocks. I read the letter once. Just once. And then I hit send. I didn't cry that night. I didn't hide anymore. I did what I had to. By the time the streetlights dimmed into the early gray dawn, I was still sitting at the table, in a kitchen that smelled neither of dinner nor of comfort, only of the hum of the refrigerator and the light of the screen. My body did not ask for sleep. It asked for the truth. And I gave it to it. I turned on the full chronology, attached a copy of the police report, indicated my first name, last name, contact information, and finally, I wrote the last sentence. Not despair, not a request, not a cry, but a command, a testament, a challenge. If I disappear, this is my voice. Publish it anyway. I reread it twice, slowly, like they read prayers in church, where the echo is not from the walls but from memory, then pressed send. Then I closed the laptop, simply lowering the lid, and leaned back in the kitchen chair, allowing myself a minute, not for rest, not for reflection, but for emptiness. Outside the tiny window, the morning was beginning, not bright, not solemn, but soft, like old fabric. The steel sky was beginning to sprout peach stains, a sky not for inspiration, but for new steps. Somewhere in the next block, someone was dragging garbage cans to the curb, their plastic wheels scraping on the asphalt. This sound was so peaceful, so mundane, that it was almost funny to think how much had changed in me, while everything around me remained the same. I did not cry last night. And I did not plan to today. But my breathing became deeper, slower, as if I had finally exhaled something that I had been holding inside for years, not because I was afraid, but because no one was listening. I stood up, went to the bathroom, turned on the light, looked in the mirror. The face was mine. The face of a woman who no longer sought explanations. The bruise under my left eye was beginning to yellow, to lose its power, to become a reminder rather than a threat. It was like an old piece of fruit forgotten in a bowl on the windowsill, still holding the past but no longer holding the power. I raised my hand, touched the skin with my fingertip. "You are no longer my shame," I whispered. It was not strong. But it was honest. My phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. I rushed to it and saw email. Alice Carrington. Subject: restoration. Submission. Body: this will not be buried. The text was short: "I'll call you in an hour." At that moment, I allowed myself to smile. Just a little, like a test beam on a face that had forgotten how to do it. I put on the coffee, washed my face with cold water, and returned to the laptop. This time, I didn't pace the room or race through my thoughts. I just sat and waited. My heart calmed, not because fear had disappeared, but because determination had arrived. 45 minutes later, the Zoom link arrived. I clicked it. Her face appeared, clear features, sharp eyes, no makeup, hair pulled back, the look of someone who doesn't ask empty questions. "Thank you for trusting me," she said. "I wasn't sure I should," I said, looking straight into the camera. "Okay. You can't trust everyone, especially the frivolous ones," she said. "But you can trust the smart ones." She checked everything, every document, every timestamp, every voice file. She didn't pity me, didn't coo, she listened and took notes. Sometimes she grinned, not maliciously, but with that professional sarcasm that women have when they've heard the same thing too often. She made it all up. This wasn't an interview. It was a handoff. A relay race. I'd run too long. Now it was her turn. But nothing prepared me for her next offer. "You're not the only one," she said. I blinked. "What?" I asked, already knowing but not believing. "There's another woman. Different name. Different condition. But same story. Same man. I'll put you through if you want." My stomach twisted. Amerigo. He'd done this before. I wasn't the first. Or the only one. Another woman, whose name I didn't yet know, had once sat like this, at a similar kitchen table, telling her truth into the void. And now we were both emerging. I nodded. Slowly but surely. "Yes, please." We ended the conversation, and Alice promised to publish the material by Monday. I closed the laptop. My hand paused for a second before the lid closed with a soft click, not like an end, but like a beginning. And then the disposable phone I kept in case things didn't go according to plan rang. An unfamiliar number lit up the screen. A message: "You made a mistake. Fix it. Or I will." I stared at the screen, not moving, not shaking. Then, slowly, without raising my voice, I said out loud, to no one in particular, "No. I just finally fixed one." I left the phone on the counter. I was not going to live in fear. Not now. Because for the first time in a long time, my voice was not alone. And by Sunday, I was no longer hiding. I was preparing. I was no longer isolated. I was part of something bigger. And I was not the only one raising a storm. By Sunday, I was no longer hiding. I was preparing. And I wasn't the only one making a storm. I buttoned up my jacket, turned up the collar to keep the chill morning wind off my neck, and walked through the side door of the old community center on Mason Street. The air inside was dry, smelling of chalk dust and old coffee, the kind they brewed late at night at Alcoholics Anonymous meetings to keep anyone who came to hang in there awake. But there was something different about the room this time, not a word, not a smell, but a feeling. People were already gathering. Women. All with different faces, but with the same shadow in their eyes, the one you could recognize even in a mirror. And I knew this was the beginning. I passed a wall covered with colorful, half-peeled leaflets, each offering something that seemed part of salvation: free self-defense workshops, grief circle schedules, support groups for women, migrants, survivors, those still on the move, those who had already begun to speak out. And in this chaotic gallery of pain and hope, my eyes found the right door, behind which Eliza, whose organization was both armor and refuge, had reserved a room for us. The folding plastic chairs creaked in greeting as I sat down, and the sound struck me as a strange peace, not comfort, but a kind of calm welcome into a space where everything that had once been hidden could now be named. Across the chipped, faded laminate table, two women looked up, and I met their gazes, Letitia and Paula, both slightly older than me, both with faces where makeup was not an adornment but a shield, a protective veil over the experience. We greeted each other without ceremony, without tears, without hugs, as not victims do, but strategists do, those who know what it's like to stay afloat when the rest of the world is pretending not to see you sink. It had all been started by Alice. She had called each of us on Friday, her voice on the phone low and sure: "You're not alone. This is not it. It's time for you to meet." Donna was the first to break the silence. "We're not here to swap war stories, are we?" And I nodded, catching her eye. "No. We're here to change the rules of the game." She agreed, nodding, her fingers tightly gripping the time-lost folder, the corners worn as if she had read it in frustration 100 times. "Financial manipulation," she said simply. He forged my signature, transferred the company accounts to himself, and left me with the IRS breathing down my neck. Paula added, looking out the window, "Not at us. He isolated me. Everything is in his name. The first time I filed charges, they told me I didn't seem scared enough. The second time, the DA said family was more important. That it was better to settle the matter peacefully." I leaned forward, bowing my head so that we could all hear each other. "What we have now is not just stories. These are receipts." Paula slid a flash drive across the table. Letitia unrolled printouts and spreadsheets. I pulled out my laptop, plugged in the shared drive Alice had created, secure, encrypted, hidden behind a neutral name that no one would suspect. We uploaded everything: bank statements, medical records, screenshots of conversations, photographs, police reports, copies of applications that had been ignored or put on hold. Every time the system turned away, we saved the moment, recorded the refusal, because we knew the day would come when no one would be able to say, "We didn't know." That day, we launched small but strong. A private website, one landing page, free names, free stories, and one headline, written in black and white: "We don't ask for justice. We show the evidence you refuse to see." My last upload was an audio clip of Amerigo's voice, low and lazy, and yet with that eternal mockery in his tone: "Even if you scream, no one listens." I wrote a short caption underneath: "We heard each other. That's enough. No hashtags. No hysteria. Just reality." Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I drove back to the apartment. The wind had picked up, not much, but it seemed to know that something had changed. I stopped at the corner market and picked up a package of pasta and 2 lemon bars. I'd never liked them, but they were my mother's favorite. Maybe I just wanted to remember that someone had once cared. Or maybe it was part of that quiet farewell that doesn't happen in a courtroom but happens in the heart. At home, I plugged in my phone, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the website of the news Alice worked for. In her editorial folder was a draft of a headline: "Hands behind the silence. 3 women. 1 man. And the system that let him wander." The words looked at me like something sacred and dangerous at the same time. I placed my palm on the countertop to keep my balance. My other hand almost automatically touched the yellowed bruise under my eye. Still there. A reminder, but no longer a mark. "You're not a disgrace anymore," I whispered, and at that moment I made the mistake of opening Instagram. Amerigo had a new post. A photo from our wedding. Me in lace. He in navy blue. The caption, no one knew her like I did. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. He was teasing, playing to the crowd, to old friends, family, churchgoers, all those who still believed in his mask. He was waiting for a reaction. I gave him silence. And something better. I opened my cloud folder and found a photo I'd been saving for years. A hospital bracelet. The date, the name, it was all there. It was the night I was hospitalized after falling down the stairs. A year before our wedding. The time Amerigo had driven me to the hospital himself and told the nurse, "She's just clumsy." I posted the photo. No caption. No text. Just the truth. The raw, ugly, undeniable truth. And then I logged out. Around 7:30 in the morning, as the first fragile streaks of light began to break through the gray, overcast sky and the wind picked up, making the window panes rattle with a thin, almost musical tremor, I stood in the kitchen, leaning against the cold counter, making myself a breakfast that felt more like dinner, pasta with the remains of sautéed vegetables, and watched the steam rise slowly from the pan, dissolving into the air, leaving no trace. I could barely taste the food, but I kept cooking, not because I was hungry but because I needed action, simple, rhythmic, grounding. I didn't feel brave, and the anger had left me too, dissolving into the days when pain still needed labels. Now it was something else, thick, deep, steady, not loud but solid, as if inside me, after years of hunching over to survive, my spine had finally straightened. Before going to bed, I walked around the apartment, habitually, without rushing, checking all the locks twice, not out of fear, but out of respect for memory, for those layers of me that once trembled at every creak. I knew that Elisa's article would come out on Monday morning, and now, as the hands of the clock slowly crept toward midnight, I understood. We had less than a day left before the truth, laid out on virtual pages, ceased to be the quiet confessions of survivors and became something more than personal. It became public, political, human, and everyone would have to choose a side. I lit a candle, the same one, dusty, forgotten, which I had not touched since the move. My therapist once said that rituals are important when you reclaim your space. And so I sat in the dim room, the flames flickering softly in the corner, casting shadows on the walls, and I whispered, not a prayer, not a plea, but an affirmation addressed only to myself. Whatever happens, I am ready. The article came out at 7:02 a.m. I didn't have to look far. It was pinned to the top of every major news feed, on every platform, as if the network itself knew this story needed to be heard. At 9 a.m., the phone rang, Amerigo's lawyer's name on the screen. I didn't pick it up. At 9:15, another notification came, from his firm. This time, without the flourishes, termination proceedings have begun. Confidentiality lifted. A formal statement will be issued within the hour. I watched the screen, barefoot at the sink, a mug of cold tea by my side, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was not reacting, not defending myself, not pretending. I was just breathing. I didn't force the issue, didn't post screenshots, didn't forward emails to friends. I just exhaled. The quietest sound of the morning. But the most important. I spent the day as normally as possible, folded laundry, fed the cat, wiped the edge of the windowsill where dust had accumulated, not because it had to be done, but because I needed to remind myself, I'm alive. I checked my phone from time to time, not obsessively, but regularly enough to notice how the comments under the article multiplied. Someone thanked Elisa for the report, someone shared their truth, someone simply wrote, "Thank you." But what stopped me came in the form of a private message. A woman named Camilla, whose name I had never heard before. She wrote, I read the article. I was one of his patients. Thank you for speaking up. I sat down at the table not because I felt weak, but because my knees were shaking in a different way, not with fear, but with something more like release. Around noon, the phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I hesitated, but answered. Mercier, I said. Patricia Mercier. The voice on the other end was calm, female, with a slight legal accent. Yes. My name is Teron Everett. I represent the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. I wanted to let you know that we are reopening your case. I didn't answer right away, my mind seemingly shutting down, unable to process a phrase that had been dangerous to believe so many times. She went on, I'm sorry it took so long. There were procedural barriers. But now that some of the information is public, especially the audio, those barriers no longer apply. I could have said a lot. I could have asked why it took an article, hundreds of votes, a storm raised by strangers, but I didn't. I just said, thanks for catching up. And she knew what I meant. We scheduled the formal announcement for Thursday. After the call, I went to the bedroom. For no particular reason. I just went. The closet door was ajar, and I opened it wider, stepped inside, just like I had done months ago, in the days when the only form of truth was whispered between dresses and coats. I remembered it clearly, the phone pressed to my chest, the voice almost inaudible, I'll just record this, just in case. That same audio recording, with his voice, in which there was no remorse, only superiority and calculation, was now embedded at the end of Alice's article. And now, as Turan said, it was officially part of the court case. The phone vibrated in my pocket again. I returned to the kitchen, with that slow step that appears when there is no longer panic in the body, but wariness still lives inside you, taut as a thin string. I unlocked the screen, half expecting another message of support. There had been so many of them in the last few days that I no longer wondered, but simply accepted them, like the light in a window in the morning. But it wasn't it. It was him. Amerigo. His name still caused a strange tightness in me, not fear, not pain, not anger, but an echo of something I had separated from, but whose echo continued to wander within the walls of memory. He had just uploaded a video. I opened it slowly, already knowing what the intonation would be, what facial expressions, what words. This was not interest, this was completion. No editing, no music, just his face, shot from close up, his hair disheveled, his eyes red, his voice trembling. They paint me as a monster, he said. She makes it sound like I'm some kind of rapist. I loved her. I still love her. But this is cruel. She is not the woman you think she is. She is vindictive. I watched in silence, not because I was shocked, but because I could finally see this performance not from the inside, not out of blind affection, but from the outside, through the eyes of someone who no longer wears his mask on her face. That voice, trembling, which had seemed sincere before, now sounded like a desperate attempt to put on a mask that had long since fallen and cracked. The comments under the video were initially mixed. Some were supportive, some wavered, but then one response rose above the rest like a banner. A woman wrote, she did not break the silence. She lived through it. This is louder. The phrase was shared more than 30,000 times within an hour. I closed the video, put the phone next to the cup, and simply looked out the window. It was already well past noon when another notification arrived, this time a legal one. The protective order was expanded to require the defendant to surrender all registered firearms by 10 p.m. today. Signed, Tyler. I read the message twice, then a third time, slowly, the way you read a decree where every letter matters. The timestamp matched the motion. That meant he had already been served. That meant he knew. I leaned back in my chair, allowing myself to simply watch the thin shaft of sunlight stretching across the floor from under the curtain, shifting with each passing minute, as if the world were still moving even when you stood still. My tea had gone cold. My cat was curled up in the same patch of sunlight he had always considered his own, as if nothing had changed. And yet the air in the room was different, not empty, not anxious, but still, filled with something that could be called clarity. I said it out loud, looking at no one, more at the walls than at myself. We're not done, but we're not invisible anymore. There was no anger in my voice, no desire to convince anyone. Just the truth. And the truth, when it finally has a place to exist, doesn't need to be shouted. That night, I lit a candle again. Not in remembrance, not in grief, but for the fact that for too long I had forgotten that I deserved peace. A week later, as the sun sank below the city skyline, casting long shadows on the sidewalks, I stood in front of the courthouse again. The same steps, the same massive brass-plated doors, but this time my knees didn't shake. In my hands, I held a sealed manila folder, the final papers, filed in person, a petition to finalize a divorce, an application to maintain a protective order pending judgment. It wasn't heavy, but it carried the weight of years, words, blows, silences. It might have been carved from stone. But the reason I stood there tonight wasn't the papers. I came to meet others. A breeze twitched the hem of my coat as I watched the cars go by, honking, headlights flashing, the occasional laughter from the outdoor cafe across the street. The courthouse loomed behind me, quiet now, the last clerk just locking the side door. Suddenly headlights flared in the parking lot. A car pulled up. Vanessa got out first. She didn't wave. She just looked at me, her eyes full of understanding, as if all the conversations had already been said. Letitia followed, her coat sleeves rolled up, her face calm, with the weariness that comes not from the shoulders but from within. Paula came last, holding a small candle. It was unlit. We didn't need a flame. We were the light. We didn't speak. We didn't need words anymore. They stood next to me, lined up like the columns of a temple we had built out of memory and mutual recognition. I once came here alone, I murmured, barely audible. Now I leave with my sisters. Vanessa squeezed my hand, Letitia smiled softly, Paula simply nodded. The last rays of sunlight touched the horizon, painting the sky lavender and amber. We stood there, four women, looking at a building where once there had been only silence. Now there were footsteps. I turned, holding the folder tightly, like a banner, and we walked in together. Inside, the hallway was dim, the ceiling fluorescent, like an old memory. The clerk behind the counter did not look up. I walked over, put down the envelope. He glanced at it. "Final processing?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes." He stamped the form and slid the paper into a metal tray without looking. No cameras, no crowd, no lawyers. No Amerigo. Only the sound of paper sliding over metal. "Anything else?" he asked. I looked at him, then at my people. "No," I said. "That's all." The return to the street was quiet, almost solemn in its ordinariness, as if the very atmosphere, saturated with the breath of the cold evening, understood that I was no longer walking as a victim, not as an accuser, not as someone who was being muffled or hidden behind formulations and signatures, but as a woman who no longer had fear behind her, but testimony. When I pushed the glass doors, the air seemed thick, fresh, enveloping, cool on my skin, tart in my lungs, as if it reminded me that I was breathing, which meant I was alive, and that meant a lot. I stood on the steps for a moment longer, watching a couple across the street, a woman and a man, walking hand in hand, discussing something about a conspiracy, a TV series or an article, perhaps, and a little boy chasing a stubborn pigeon on the lawn of the courthouse, shouting not words but sounds filled with pure, unacceptable freedom. Life went on. Even when yours was suspended, frozen, caught between reports and silence, everything around you moved anyway, without asking if you were ready. Letitia, standing a little further away, reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a steaming thermos. I took a sip. The drink was still warm, familiar, a little tart, a little sweet, like the evening after a difficult conversation, when you no longer search for words. "I remember the first time I called you," Paula said, her voice almost a whisper. "You seemed small. Not weak. Just hidden." "It was," I said, looking at her not through the eyes of who I had become, but of who I was then. "It seemed safer to hide." There was a pause, deep, respectful, like the beginning of an important confession. "But you still picked up the phone," Vanessa added. And that moment, so simple, so naked, settled inside me like the truth I'd always known but been afraid to admit. Because that was everything, wasn't it? I didn't scream in the streets. I didn't throw a fit. I didn't smash windows or throw his things away. I just picked up the phone one day. Whispered. Wrote. Waited. And then I walked. I blinked, and all those images came back at once. The first bruise I covered with concealer, not because it didn't hurt, but because I had a visit to my parents. My mother's gaze, slipping down to the floor, not into my eyes. Amerigo's voice, as after the first forgive me came the first it's your own fault. The click of the lock, and after it, silence. And then I, in the closet, among the clothes, in the semi-darkness, with a trembling hand pressing the phone to my lips. My name is. I'm afraid, but I will no longer pretend that there is none. That clip, included in Alice's article and now part of the court file, wasn't there for the drama. It was there because it was true. I exhaled slowly, looking up at the courthouse windows, imagining someone there, a young intern, a secretary, a prosecutor, just an employee, sitting and reading my file. Maybe they would stop. Not out of pity, not out of guilt, but because they would hear a woman who didn't demand volume, didn't demand applause, simply survived. I turned to the others. I'm going to walk home, I said. Are you sure? Vanessa asked. I nodded. I need air. No one argued. We knew too well that after days like these, words were only for goodbyes. They hugged me one by one. No pathos, no, we'll do it, we had already done it. When Paula pulled away, she placed a small candle in my palm, the same one she had held in front of the building. For your window, she said. In case someone is still out there, looking for proof that something better is possible. I walked the rest of the way alone, the candle tucked into my coat pocket, like a symbol. The streets glowed amber, the streetlights cast elongated shadows, the air was clear, and my steps were not light. No, it was not freedom yet, but they were no longer constrained, as before. I reached my apartment, opened the door, took off my shoes, and walked through the rooms, not turning on every light as I once did, not checking the closet, not listening to the hallway. This place was not large, but it was mine. And it was quiet, not the kind of silence that hides blows, but the kind that gives you the right to exhale. I went to the window. That one. That I once looked into when he didn't come back. And on those nights when I prayed that he wouldn't come back. I lit a candle. The flame, small and modest, reflected in the glass, and its light was as it should be, not blinding, not challenging, just clear. And then I whispered. Not to the room. Not to him. Maybe to her. To the one I once was. Bruises that no one sees are also wounds. Pauses in the voice are also screams. And silence, if it is healing, is also an act of resistance. I stood for a long time, motionless, watching the candle burn, and in its light I no longer saw what I had lost. I was beginning to see who I had become. Write a comment what you think about this story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and put a like. See you soon.